right, so getting started, we just want to welcome you today and thank you for joining us. Today the staff on this call will be myself, Ruth Sugar, and Larry Condelli and Marcella Movit. We're from the NRS Training Project team. And the purpose of today's webinar is to present some training activities and tools and ideas that you can use with your local program directors to improve the collection of post-exit data. So we have two files that you can access while we're on the call today. One of them is the activity packet, which has the different activities and resources that we've developed for you. And we will be referencing them during the call. And I'm just going to ask for folks to put yourself on mute. We're hearing a little bit of background noise.
Is that how old he is? Is that how old he is? Oh, I have to ask. Tony would know her husband.
Okay. We have some background noise, so if you can mute your phone, please, that would be great. Okay. So you can access the activity packet if you look in the bottom right corner of the screen under the area that says Files. So there's the activity packet, and then we also have available to you the guide, which is called Demonstrating Success, a Technical Assistance Guide for Collecting Data for Post-Exit Indicators. And that is an extensive guide that has a lot more detail and explanations than the activity packet, and it's a good reference for you to use for yourselves and to refer program directors to so that you can think of other training activities and your professional developers can look at it and also pull out some key information and create other activities. So you can open these files by clicking on them. However, if you're not able to open them, do not worry, you can still actively engage in the webinar today. Okay. So for today's webinar, we're going to have one poll that we'd like you to do. Then we'll have several different chat pods. One is the general chat pod, which you're familiar with, which you can put your questions into, and that is on the right side of your screen. But the main area that we'll be using throughout the webinar is particular chat pods that will come up with the questions listed in them. And we would like you all to put your responses in there so that everyone can see them clearly. There's a little more space in those pods, so we hope that everyone can follow the discussions that we're going to have today. And then finally, at the end of the webinar, we do have a link to a brief evaluation that we would appreciate you filling out so we can see how things went and how we can improve in the future. So the objectives of our webinar today will be reviewing the definitions and calculations for post-exit indicators to make sure everyone feels comfortable with those. We will identify challenges in collecting data for post-exit indicators as a group. We'd also have you explore strategies for effectively and accurately collecting these data. And throughout, we will review tools to assist in understanding and data collection of the post-exit indicators by local programs. So a key factor is we want to help your local programs better understand and collect these data. So really quickly, going through the agenda, we're going to start out with Larry doing an overview of the post-exit indicators, what they are and how to calculate them. As a group, we'll identify challenges that you're experiencing. And then also as a group, we'll have 4 rounds where we will brainstorm strategies and then review the materials in the activity packet. And then, of course, at the end, we'll have a chance for a Q&A, see what other areas and questions you want to address today. Okay, so that was a quick run-through of the what you're going to do today in our Train the Training webinar. So we want to begin with a poll. So if you can look at the first question, it says, our state is having difficulty collecting post-exit data for one or more of the post-exit indicators. So you can say that you agree totally, you somewhat agree, or you disagree. You're not having any trouble. Okay, and then we have the second one. It looks like folks are answering both, and that's great. Okay, so we're just going to give you a minute or so more because there's a lot of folks on the line. We want to make sure people provide their input on these questions. Okay. So at this point, looks like we've gotten a lot of people on question number 2. The first question, people haven't decided, I guess. So I think we can see the results now. Oh, okay, these are the results. Okay, so it looks like about half of you really do think that you're having some challenges, and a bunch of folks feel like you somewhat do. So that's why all of you are on the call, so that's great. And then it's kind of spread around in terms of what people are having difficulties with, but it looks like collecting the credentials data is the most challenging. Okay, and then also some of the employment indicators are facing challenges for everybody. Okay, well this is helpful to know, and we're going to move forward and share a lot of strategies and ideas with one another to address some of these issues. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Larry, who's going to do a review of the post-exit indicators for you.
Okay, then. Thank you, Ruth, and thank you all for joining us today. As she mentioned in the introduction, this is a train the trainer, so it is primarily to provide resources and materials for you to use with local staff or other staff to understand the indicators, and not only to understand them, but to do a better job collecting them and identify some of the challenges and issues. So what I'm going to do now very briefly is just briefly describe the post-exit indicators and when they're collected and how they're calculated. As Ruth referenced, our post-exit indicator guide, which you could get a copy, which is also on the NRS website, that goes into great detail about all the steps for collecting them and strategies for improvement and how they're calculated and their definitions. And much of the content we have today comes from that guide. So if you want a longer, more detailed version of what we're discussing, you can look at that. So let me just go very simply. These slides here, next to these slides, you could use to have kind of a general audience that isn't that familiar with the indicators, and it's very simply explains them. Go back a second. Yeah. So one thing to know about the indicators is that they're only collected on participants after they exit, so that's why they're post-exit. If the participant is still enrolled, you don't collect any of the indicators on the participant until that time, and then that starts the clock for you, because several of the indicators have time periods tied to it. They all do, and actually have time periods tied to them. You do it you do them for each period of participation, even if it's the same individual. So if they come more than once, for more than one POP, you've got to just keep collecting them again on that same individual with the time frame that's designated by the POP. And finally, there are some exclusions. I'm going to kind of not discuss those today, and I'll make the assumption when you see the next slides that we're excluding those participants. Those are criteria that have been defined through various memoranda from OCTAE and the Department of Labor, and they include those who have medical issues and had to leave the program for more than 90 days, being called up to the military, or if the participant is deceased. So those participants are excluded from all the post-exit indicators, and we'll just assume that in the following slides. Okay, so the first two ones we'll talk about are the employment measures, and those are pretty straightforward. Essentially, you collect those on everybody after they exit. And as the name says, in the second quarter after they exit, if they're employed at any time during that period, they are counted as employed, and then you create a rate there with the total number of participants who exit is the denominator, and those who obtained employment anytime during the second quarter after exit is the numerator, and that creates your second employment rate or percentage. And it's the same thing with the fourth quarter employment, in that you count everybody, include everybody who exited, again with the exception of the excluded. And that is your denominator, and among that pool of participants, anyone who's employed in the fourth quarter after exit is counted, and that is how the ratio is computed and the rate that we use. Now, median earnings is a really unique indicator in that it is not an individual number. It's like you don't tie that earnings to any particular person, but it's actually a statistical number about your entire cohort. The cohort in this case are all participants who were employed in the second quarter after exit. So that's who we put into this group, the median earnings, when we calculate it. Any participant employed in the second quarter after exit. And they become essentially what you do, and you have, I'm sure there are computer programs that you have that do this, rank order the second quarter earnings, either ascending or descending, doesn't matter, and you pick the range, the number that's exactly in the middle, where half are below and half are above. That becomes the median earnings that is reported, whatever that dollar figure is for the entire group of participants. Now, there is a rule that if you do a data match and it comes up as 0 wages, that person is considered unemployed and gets a 0, is not employed. If you do a survey, and we'll talk a little bit about surveys later on, and the participant says, I'm employed, but I don't want to tell you what I make for whatever reason, for privacy reasons, or they're unable to calculate it, we do permit you to count that person as employed, and you put $1 in as median wages. So that is only for use, though, when you do survey. So that is how you do the employment, rather the median earnings calculation. Okay, now our next indicator is not so simple, and that is the one which I saw on the poll we just had, that half the participants, half of you are having issues, more than 65% of you are having issues, double of more than any other indicator. And that's quite understandable because it is so complicated. First of all, one thing to know about this indicator is it includes 2 credentials, your secondary diploma and your post-secondary credential. And let's, so that makes it complicated. So let's talk again, start with the numerator, as we did before. So who is, does this indicator apply to? It's all exited participants who either were in the secondary cohort, which is those who had entered without a secondary diploma and were enrolled in a secondary level program sometime during their period of participation, or participants who are enrolled in at the same time in adult ed and post-secondary, and they exited from post-secondary. So it's a fairly complicated denominator. Again, the secondary part is anyone who came in without a secondary diploma and were enrolled at some time during their period of participation in secondary instruction, or if a participant was co-enrolled in adult ed and post-secondary and they exited the post-secondary component. One thing that's important with this indicator is a participant is only counted once in it. So if it happens that a participant is in both groups, like they're doing a secondary and a post-secondary credential, if they're working toward that, you only count them one time. And then if they attain, and then the numerator is either you got your secondary credential while enrolled or with 1 year, or you got your secondary diploma and the participant within 1 year of exit either is enrolled in post-secondary or employed. So it becomes, even the numerator is complicated. We have multiple parts. For the secondary part, participant who exited and within 1 year is either employed or entered post-secondary, and for the post-secondary part, anyone who got a secondary credential who was in that cohort, co-enrolled and exited post-secondary. And again, you only count for the credential rate indicator calculation, you only count that person one time if they happen to fall into both groups. Now, that table 5 reporting is different. I'm not going to talk about that, but you break all that out in table 5. But for the actual calculation, it is not broken out. It is all just one number that comes in the end. Now, I know this is complicated, and you may have questions. So what I ask you to do, if you do have a question that we'll answer at the end of this webinar, just type it in the chat pod, or when we open up the lines, you can ask it verbally. So I don't want to delay the webinar any further. So that's a very short summary of a rather complicated issue, particularly the credential indicator. But I'm going to turn it back over to Ruth, who's going to lead us in our first discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Larry. So the next thing we wanted to talk about is for all of you to have an opportunity to really explain some of the challenges that you're experiencing in collecting the post-exit data in terms of both credentials and employment. So we're going to pull up 2 chat pods where you can put in, or 1 chat pod where you can put in the challenges that you're having and what you think the source of the issues is, why you're having difficulty. And if you can explain to us, give us some details, that would be helpful. And also if you can just hold off at this point on making any suggestions to one another or providing solutions, we would appreciate it, because we will get to that next, and we want to hear everything people have to say in terms of strategies and suggestions, but just not at this point. Okay, so we see that a number of people are typing in their answers. Okay, so Amy is saying data match with students who do not have and do not provide Social Security numbers. Yeah, I think that's going to be a very common issue across all programs and states. Yep, Social Security numbers, just a big issue. Okay, it's not a scientific, the data comparison is not scientific since it's participants' employment testimony is used, right? So you're hearing just what people are saying about their employment versus having official documentation by using the Social Security number. Higher ed is not providing post-secondary information. It's been hard to show EFL gains with TABE 11 and 12. The fact that there's a lack of single credible information in a national database of industry recognized credentials for a data match. Okay, so having to look across different data sources is hard. Problems collecting employment to get a job out of state. So yeah, a lot of folks are transient, moving around to different states. People having difficulty with survey response and not getting as much information as you need on that. Funding for training and IET leads to credentials and cooperation of community college CTE departments. So that becomes a challenge to get information from the community colleges. Problems determining post-secondary credential attainment. Yep, so I think that's a big issue for everyone. Wage information is missing from bordering states. Issues matching people who are going to post-secondary to another state. So yep, that came up with some other states as well. Confusion about the credentials that are applicable. Yes, I think that it is a complicated indicator, as Larry mentioned. Data match, even for those that provide Social Security numbers, because they're self-employed and subcontractors don't get reported to unemployment insurance. Okay, so yeah, so different types of employment posing challenges. Post-secondary and private schools that don't come up in data matches. Okay, so it's not easy to locate that information. Again, higher ed not providing the data that's needed. So Terry's saying the biggest issue is they have a handful of clients getting to adult secondary ed level instruction, which really affects the denominator. Surveying is hard. Yeah, we have some suggestions for surveying today, but we do know that it does require additional work. Okay. All right. So the MIS is not able to track students who've already been contacted for the survey and unable to separate those who've not responded or cannot be contacted. Okay. I believe other different states have done different things around that and been successful, so I hope we'll have some people share what they've done. And federal employment is not in the unemployment database. Right, so there are different databases that you have to access to get some specific types of employment categories. Okay, well this is a really terrific list, and you hit upon all the things that we had identified and then also additional ones. So thank you very much for all that information. So we're going to move ahead and just sort of give you a frame for the next portion of the webinar. And that is that we identified really 4 areas that we thought would be helpful in terms of strategizing how to address some of those challenges that you just raised. And those 4 categories were messaging and communication in terms of how to inform the local program staff and directors about the importance of collecting these data, professional development and how you can help folks understand. You did mention that sometimes things are confusing, and there's ways that you can help local program staff figure out better ways to approach the data collection. Tracking and data sharing, that came up a lot in your comments, and also supplemental data collection also came up a lot. So we're hoping that the information that we discussed today can give you some ideas. So as we go through each one of these strategy categories, we're going to hear from you, and then we want to show you a tool that we've come up with that we hope will be helpful. So we're going to move ahead. So we're going to ask you again to share your thoughts about these particular areas. So with messaging and communication, we're interested to hear how you're communicating with local program staff about the importance of collecting these data. If you have any particular types of messaging that you're doing or particular channels of communication that you're using, and what you think that your staff at the local level, sort of what their perspective is, sort of what they hear about the importance of these data, what you think they understand about it. And then, you know, it's sort of interesting to know if you feel that students are also getting particular messaging about what information needs to be collected from them. So if you can start putting your responses in the chat pods, that would be great. Okay, so Liz says data drives direction. Monthly calls with providers is a strategy about communicating information. Monthly online meetings with the local directors. Listserv messages, another way, and professional development and state updates. Okay, meetings and a handbook and quarterly reports to provide, you know, specific information. Training and creating the right tools. So someone mentioned before they're having trouble collecting data because of their MIS, but they might have some suggestions. Michigan has a post-exit follow-up report that can be used at any time and with specific items. Webinars and statewide trainings. So state ops memos is a way folks are getting information. Monthly calls and technical assistance. Reviewing data collection in bi-monthly webinars. and direct feedback to specific programs through your technical assistance. Monthly administration meetings. Let's see. Forms where local programs can report the information that won't be data matched. Individual program reminders that they receive through email or phone calls. Workshops on MIS and quarterly workshops with program directors. Mentoring for new directors, great idea. Quarterly calls and meetings, okay, other folks are doing that. Okay, and reinforcing the characteristics of eligibility, so some of the understanding of the particular things that apply to each participant. So Terry says that they use data for everything, so they use a data dashboard to provide the locals with the information they need. And they rank programs on a weekly basis, so people are seeing where they perform against others. Okay, so that's some of the ways that you all are communicating. And then in the other section, so the messages, okay, so email and Teams meeting, teacher handbook, and forms updates. Okay, so that looks like it's ways that you're communicating, which seems great. And then in terms of students, some providers introduce this at intake and reinforce it at the exit, and some others do not do this. Okay, so you have some variation in how the messages are getting to students. So it's hard to know what the local programs are telling students, okay, because it's so dependent on the local efforts. So I think that some of what you mentioned in terms of what you're communicating at the state level to the program directors is not filtering down. So Cheryl's saying that she thinks providers could do a better job at informing students about the need for information. Connie says that ideally it would be discussed, emphasizing the why. Right, so when you're doing follow-up with them, why are they hearing from you? Why is it important? Okay. I'm going to go back to the center question for what the directors are hearing. Can you go up to the top? Okay, so so Sue is saying that in a monthly notice that folks are being told that they need to do reports and quarterly data reviews on performance indicators. Okay, so people are getting the message that you are consistently approaching them. You need to get information on their data collection. So they're getting a pretty consistent message. That's good. Anson mentions, funding for local follow-up staff to carry this out. So recommending that they get additional support in carrying out these activities. Okay, using the calls and webinars. Okay, they don't, let's see, Toby said since we don't tie this to funding like MSG and enrollment, they're probably hearing that this isn't important. Okay, so that's an interesting point, sort of mixed messages that people are getting in terms of the significance. So I think, following some of the strategies and suggestions that folks have mentioned in that first answer, can help with reinforcing the importance of the message. Let's see. NRS reports and metrics are the driving factor for local program performance. So Matt is saying that. Okay. And bringing in the funding issue, follow-up measures are used in funding in Arkansas. Okay. All right. Well, this is great. Again, these are a lot of good points and good strategies in terms of what people are currently doing. And then also the issue around what messages are people hearing, what are staff hearing, what are students hearing, that can also influence the success rate. So I'm glad that we were able to delve into this and see everybody's approaches that they're using. So next I wanted to just introduce you to an activity that we think could be helpful for you. It's in the activity packet. And in the activity packet, at the beginning of the packet, it's just an overview of the different tools that are in there. And then on page 3, we have an activity called the importance of calculating performance for the post-exit indicators. And so the idea behind this tool was for local program staff to be able to have some fictional data and really plug it in to the calculations so that they can see what the impact is on if you have particular information on student performance versus if you are not collecting Social Security numbers, for example, and what that's going to do to your performance numbers. And then also, as part of that tool, there are a set of discussion questions so that you can work with the locals and really think through, help them understand, well, how do you do this, but also what is the importance, and if they're getting, attitudes or, opinions or feedback from their local staff about why things are challenging, as some of the things that you mentioned, some ways to discuss that so that there's some sort of situations and scenarios that you can walk through with your program directors that they can then use with their staff as well, sort of help people problem solve. So that is one tool. So next.
Could I just say a little about that too? Also, you'll see this calculations. Show the next slide. Yeah. One of the things we do in that, we have fake data which is very, somewhat artificial in that it's just presented there with the numbers. We don't really explain all of the complexities of the different time periods and all that. It's just the numbers so that someone, staff can put the numbers in and make the calculation. So it's a good way of understanding where the numbers come from and how they're created. And so that's why we have that. And also, as Ruth said, there's nice discussion activities that will uncover some of the things that we just discussed in the chat pods about what messages they're getting and what they're listening to and their level of understanding. So thank you.
And also with this particular tool, there is an answer key. So if you're feeling that you might be unsure about some of the calculations or things like that, or even some potential answers, if you're not hearing them from your program staff, there's some potential things you could also bring up with them as suggestions and things like that. So next we wanted to hear from you about, in hearing about this tool and in hearing from your colleagues what they've written about what they're doing, is there anything that sort of sparked to you that you might try it in your state, that you think it'll help you address the challenge of communicating, messaging and communication with your local programs? Okay. So would you use the tool or maybe modify it? Is it something that you would do kind of at a large professional development session, or maybe something you would introduce more at a site visit? Did you see something that another state is doing that you are going to adopt? Okay, so Connie says that should probably modify it, but would definitely consider using it for professional development. Okay. And that is definitely something about these tools, is that we hope that they are sort of starting points for you. Sometimes you can just use it as is, and we hope that's helpful, but also, maybe it just gives you ideas for other things that you can develop. Okay? Christine used it as part of an on-demand module. Okay, so Christine, is that like an online module? Okay, Kelly, she plans to review the tool and guide and will likely use it for the monthly PD meetings. Great. So yeah, as we mentioned earlier, the guide really has a lot of information that you could pull out and use in different ways. Liz said that the activity seems non-threatening. It's a non-threatening approach, which I'm glad to hear that. I hope that people do see it as just a way to kind of delve into the numbers in a different way and sort of discuss what they mean and the impact on program performance. Okay, and in terms of the data that's here, it's fictional. It doesn't relate to any program. We just put it in so that you'd have something to work with, but you can obviously use your own data instead. Okay, so Virginia is saying that this could be ways to encourage programs to explain to students what the importance of sharing their Social Security numbers is. See, it could be used at an annual directors meeting in May. Okay, and maybe used through a webinar. And Christine mentioned using it in an online platform. Okay, great. So it does seem that people are seeing some use for this, and we're glad, and that you can see different ways you can implement it. Okay, so we're going to move on because we want to get to a couple other tools. This information, as you know, is recorded, so if you feel like you missed anything, you can go back and look at people's comments. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Marcella. I'm going to talk to you about another strategy area.
Okay, so it sounds like a lot of you have a lot of ideas already for some professional development that you'd like to do based on our webinar today and some of the information that we're sharing. But I know that many of you have already provided some training previously. So we're interested in hearing a little bit about the strategies that you've already used. So I'm going to open up a chat pod now that asks, have you provided training to your local programs on post-exit indicators? And what strategies have been effective? I know that often the professional development that is successful and that your local programs are responsive to might vary a lot by context. So we're really interested in what has worked for you. So a lot of people are typing, so I'm really excited to hear all the answers that we're going to have in just a moment. Okay, so having a monthly user group meeting is a great idea. It allows people to discuss and perhaps clear up any misunderstandings that exist about the post-exit indicators. And making it monthly means that people know that they have an opportunity that they'll get any of their answers or any of their questions answered if they have anything that comes up. Okay, and in Arkansas, they include it in data entry and data use training. That's fantastic. And I like that you draw that connection there between accurate and complete reporting and the impact on funding and performance. Often we just sort of assume that people know that that's the case, but it's important to make that very explicit sometimes. Okay, so Matt shared that they advise that people do the follow-up as soon as the student exits. and have a dedicated procedure. Great. Oh, Sue, I like that you have a one-page guide. That's always, these webinars, we can go back and watch later, but having a physical one-page handout is always fantastic for people to really, I picture people putting that up on their bulletin board or something to reference very easily. And Cody, it sounds like you're doing a lot of training, almost every opportunity that you have maybe, which is wonderful, so that you keep the training going and you make sure that everybody really understands what's going on. Okay. In Nevada, there is a vendor-provided training, quarterly data training, and the directors' meetings, regional meetings. So lots of opportunities there as well. So it sounds like a lot of you are doing a lot of training on this topic, which shows that you value it, and hopefully it shows that your local programs are getting the information that they need as well. Okay, so Joanne shared that the most successful training that they've done is in person. Yeah, I think that there is value really to doing, the face-to-face. And you can see people's questioning looks. It's a little harder to do virtually in a setting like this. And I love that idea of using scenario-based trainings. I think that sort of is like what Ruth shared with that first activity, the first tool that we developed. It's kind of a scenario, non-confrontational, and you're not pointing fingers at anybody. It's where everybody's able to step back a little bit and think about the post-exit indicators. Okay, so Anson did a series of performance accountability roadshows. That's great. You're making sure that everybody's getting the same message across the board. Very important. Let's see. Okay, recommend following up. Okay, so it sounds like a lot of you are doing a lot of professional development already, and that's fantastic. And as I said earlier, I'm hopeful that the tools that we're sharing with you today will be useful to you in helping to augment, enhance, help you with those trainings that you're doing. That's great. Connie, I wanted to let you finish what you were typing. Okay, great. So Perkins, we start with the denominator. Great. So that they can understand the pool of people who are working with. Right, so you want to make sure that you break down each of the pieces. Okay, well, good. So like I said, it's really interesting to me to hear that there's a lot of similarities in the strategies that have been successful, but it sounds like a lot of people are using things that are just a little bit different. And hopefully you heard some great and read about some great ideas that you might be interested in maybe following up with someone on. So I wanted to share with you another tool that you might want to consider using as part of your professional development. And this one is it's on page 12 of our activity packet. But again, it's on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen that you can click on that and download it. And it's about collecting unique identifiers such as Social Security numbers, which is a challenge that many of you mentioned earlier. So I hope that this will be a good tool for you to use as part of your professional development. And if you take a look at that, we start off by looking at the rationale for collecting Social Security numbers. And this is so that you can start to get a little bit more buy-in. And I think here we're looking at Social Security numbers, but across the board, getting that first buy-in from your local programs is critical if you want them to take a closer look at their data and really understand the importance of it. And then it asks you to look at your current practices in collecting Social Security numbers. It asks you to look at some of the challenges that you're already facing, and then consider some strategies. So suggest some strategies there that you can identify as things that you're currently using, and perhaps something sparks an idea in you and it's something that you want to use in the future, and it has space for notes. But the idea, again, although this this really looks at Social Security number. I think that for those of you who are looking for professional development ideas, this can be adapted to almost any topic related to your data use to get, again, that initial buy-in, have them understand why they're doing it, thinking about what it is that they're already doing, looking at their challenges, and talking about strategies for future improvement.
And Marcel, I'd like to add too that among the strategies, one of the purpose of the activity is to suggest the strategies, and then you can discuss, or they can discuss among themselves with you, which of those could be implemented and which might be helpful. And there's, I believe, 4 different strategies, ways to message and to staff to make them see that the importance of Social Security numbers, the importance of the indicators, and why they're just as important as the others. You could set targets. You could have put information in your database, track them. There's suggestions of how to support staff through professional development and troubleshooting. How you could use technology to help increase your rate of Social Security numbers through surveys and text messaging and apps. How you could work with your partners, and how you can definitely make it known for your students the importance of this information and why you're collecting it, because it can be very intrusive, especially to those that are sensitive about giving out their Social Security numbers, or perhaps don't even have Social Security numbers. So anyway, thanks. We'll move on next.
Great. So just really quickly before we do move on, I wanted to find out from you, just as we did earlier, if looking at this tool has perhaps prompted you to think about some next steps. Sorry, and I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. How might you use this tool or resource with your local programs, and what have you learned from others about their strategies that you think you might want to put into place? I'll give you a moment to reflect on that. Okay, so perhaps you need a little bit more time to reflect on this and look a little more carefully at this tool, which is fine, and think a little bit more about what others have already shared about what they're doing. Robin said that it can be used to help instructors understand how the data is figured, or I think maybe calculated. Great. Okay, so in Massachusetts they communicate, but not enough. And so sounds to me like you might want to start communicating a little bit more regularly and reinforcing that throughout the year. I think that sounds like a great idea. You can never over-communicate, right? Okay, so I see more people are typing in, so I'm going to just wait for those answers to come through, and then we'll move on to our third strategy. So Carrie shared that the Social Security number question may help programs realize that it really helps performance, right? I think that that's true, that often they think that it's just numbers or something that we're trying to intrude on our students' lives, and they don't always see the value in that. It serves as a mechanism to address the elephant in the room, the politics, how to collect information in a sensitive manner. I think that's very important. Stress why collecting these numbers or stress collecting it more and what the value is. I agree. Okay, good. And I like that, Diane. I'm excited to hear how your meeting goes with your local program directors about how to look at their data to better understand it and how they can improve. Okay, I think we're going to move on. Sorry. Okay, let's move on to our next strategy. And I'm going to hand it back over to Ruth.
Thanks, Marcella. So the next strategy area that we wanted to discuss is tracking and data sharing. So we wanted to know what folks are doing to track information that you need from students to improve the data collection on the post-exit indicators, and what types of data reports or notifications that you've developed to track students, how you figured out time frames for reporting, and just how you're tracking the various employment and credential data. So, you know, we're curious if anyone's developed any forms or if, you know, that you can share with maybe employers or education institutions where they know exactly what you're looking for and they can provide it to you. You know, sometimes that works better in smaller communities than in larger communities, but something to think about. We know that some states have, you know, language that is just put out periodically through maybe social media or direct emails to students. That's one way to track down information. So we're just curious to hear about what types of approaches you're using along these lines. Okay. So Diane says that she has a chart that LACES provides for tracking and employment. So it makes it easy to understand which quarters you are looking for. Okay, to be able, yeah, because the time lag in collecting these data can be challenging, so it's helpful to have an electronic system that can notify you and indicate, you know, specifically when you're looking for certain information. Okay, so Terry in their MIS system has auto set the exit quarter once no attendance has been entered in 90 days. So it's easier to identify the client. So, you know, someone mentioned earlier that sometimes it's hard to track students in this way. And so here, you know, touching base with one another in terms of how you set up your MIS could be helpful. Okay, so Amanda mentions an adult post-secondary enrollment verification form. Okay, so I'm curious if you can maybe speak a little bit more on that, you know, when it's given out or how you collect it, that kind of thing. Cody mentions a chart for each student or a general chart. Okay, so I'm not sure if that is directed to a particular person on the call. Maybe someone can field that. So Matt, for the user end of our data system, there is an exited follow-up report. Or for data matching, since we are with the Department of Workforce Development, we directly data match to our unemployment insurance data. Okay, so systems, electronic systems that are set up. Amy says that they're encouraging local programs to collect Social Security numbers so that you can do data matches more easily, and you're working on expanding the institutions with which you match your post-secondary. Okay, so looking at the National Clearinghouse data and not just state schools. Interesting, okay. So Arkansas, the MIS tracks those eligible for post-exit indicators, and you have manual outcome forms that the locals can submit when a student does not have a Social Security number. Okay, so I think these various forms that you are mentioning, it'd be great to share them with one another so people have a framework to, adopt and modify for what works for their state, because these sound like really good tools. So Michigan has multiple on-demand reports that inform the programs of year-to-date performance for both MSDs and post-exited data, okay, as well as which individual participants need to be contacted and when. Okay. Oh, and Cody says that his question was in relation to Diane's statement, I think at the beginning of our chat. Okay, and he got his question answered. And some programs are using Google Forms, great for staff to report outcomes. Okay, so you have a common communication form that can be used. Okay, and they're sent to teachers and staff to submit through the form. That's great because then they can see what all the other programs are entering. Okay. So Amanda's responding to a question. So the form is signed by the student, post-secondary institution, and local program administrator confirming that the student has enrolled. Great. So having actual documentation from all the parties involved. Okay. Texas makes a good point that Google Forms are not secure. So yes, definitely something to watch out for in terms of social security numbers and other highly sensitive data. Okay, so a couple more comments. Okay, so Texas made modifications to their statewide data system, okay, to be able to capture the post-exit data. Great. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to move ahead. And Matt also makes a comment about Google Forms again, that the document is owned by Google then. So definitely questions to consider in terms of using open types of information sharing. Okay, so moving on to the next tool that we have in your tool packet, your activity packet, on page 16. This is basically just a tip sheet that helps different program staff think about the different things that they should collect and at what points they should collect it. And so this is similar, someone mentioned earlier about having sort of a tip or to-do sheet or a quick reference. This falls in that category as well. And we also suggest that you could come up with something like this, modify this based on looking at the guide and see if there's things that are not represented on this checklist that you think would be helpful. But it also just puts it in, brings it to the attention of staff that these certain things should be thought about as participants are going through the programming and after they leave programming. Okay. So I'm going to move on again to just hear from you in terms of, is a tool like this helpful to you? Were some of the other things that folks shared about how they're tracking information and different forms they're using, if you might adopt those. If you can just share with us real quickly about that. So I'm sure there are a lot of people typing, and I'm sure people have found ideas from one another in this conversation. Great, so this checklist will be used. Great. Okay. Virginia, looking forward to what we learn with the new Octane investment in text messaging for retention and whether there are implications for follow-up. Okay, so some new things on the horizon related to text messaging. Yeah, because everybody's on their phone, so text messaging is a great way to communicate. Okay, well, we're going to move ahead because we don't have a lot of time, but I hope that there is some sharing of some of the tools that you all are using to track. I think that will be helpful to one another. I'm going to pass it back over to Marcella, who's going to talk about the next tool and strategy.
Okay, so the last strategy that we wanted to share with you is using supplemental data. So in addition to the data that you are already collecting, there may be other data that is very helpful for you that will give you a better picture of what's going on with your students, especially if you are unable to collect Social Security numbers for whatever reason. Either it's not, students aren't sharing those with you, or maybe they don't have those available to give you. So one of the things that you can do is surveying. So we'll be talking about that in a moment. Some types of supplemental data that you might want to take a look at in terms of employment could be copies of quarterly tax payment, a signed letter from the employer. For credentials, you could look at the National Student Clearinghouse, Institute for Higher Education Policy. But we're interested in hearing from you, what other outside sources do you collect data from, and how have you addressed privacy and confidentiality data formats and layouts, common data definition, et cetera, which are often the issues that come up with using supplemental data. Okay, so in addition to the couple that I mentioned in terms of employment, you might also use one-stop operating systems, administrative records, self-employment worksheets. Diane shared that they do data max with higher education for post-secondary and with CWS for employment. That's great. And it sounds like Arkansas does the same thing. Which is great. All right, so Joanne does some works with the Department of Labor and with higher ed. Okay, Terry uses UI for employment, higher ed for post-secondary. It sounds like there's a lot of common sources that you're using. Data matches through the DED manager. Michigan does a daily match with Diploma Center for HSE and UI for employment. Okay, great. Now you'll be also doing with higher ed. So again, it sounds like a lot of people are using a lot of similar sources, but I'm wondering now if you could share a little bit about any privacy and confidentiality issues that you've run up against or come up against, or have how you've handled that kind of stuff, because I know that that's often really the tricky part when it comes to the supplemental data. So in Arkansas, students give permission during intake to share their social security number to data match. So then you're making sure that everyone know that you have approval for the work that you'll be doing. And then privacy is not as big of a concern. And I just saw that you said that those that do not agree are pulled for data match, okay? Or are not pulled, rather, sorry. Data matching permission on enrollment form, okay, same as Arkansas, great. Policy guidance on PII listed in our state's AEL letters. Okay, so I appreciate that it sounds like you're very conscientious of this, or in your work around this, which is really important. We want to make sure that we're addressing the privacy concerns. Intake form a signature for data matching purposes. Good. So you're up, it sounds like so far everybody has responded is very upfront with their students, so that the students know what's going on and have a better understanding of how you're using their data. Data match everyone, but only upload employment results for those who signed your release. Huh, okay. That's interesting. And that's great. For those of you who aren't able to necessarily get or do the data matching that it sounds like so many of you are using, we also wanted to share a tool with you for the development of surveys, for how to develop and how to conduct them. So this is activity 4 from that packet. It's called Supplemental Data Collection Guidelines for Conducting Surveys. And you'll see here that it has some of the primary steps to surveying participants on post-exit indicators. So of course you want to establish a schedule, you want to develop your survey instrument, figure out who you're going to be surveying, locate those who are going to be surveyed, prepare your staff, and administer the survey. We also provide some tips and some questions to help you with your the planning process for developing and conducting your survey. And I do want to point out that on page 21 there is I think a very nice table that lays it out just so that you have it all in one place, who's going to be responsible, when it's going to be done, because I know it's, for me at least, it's important to have it in writing to ensure that it does happen. It's easy to not do that if you don't have it explicitly written. So I hope that you'll find this tool to be helpful for you if you are either thinking about developing a survey, if you're thinking about maybe adjusting a survey that you already have for your students to collect some supplemental data from them. So as you look through activity 4, yet again, like with the other tools that we presented, I'm curious to hear a little bit about how you think you might use this tool. And what have you learned from others from their discussion, either about how they're doing their privacy or how they're what they're using, what their sources are of supplemental data? Any ideas you have for the future?
And as you're thinking about that, I just wanted to comment about surveying in general. I think it seems to me before WIA, there were more states doing surveys. And I haven't heard, and I didn't see in the chat pod that many of you were doing it, and I haven't heard, just anecdotally and talking to states, many states that are doing this. So I guess one of the reasons is WIO was such a sea change, and it seems, well, it is much more difficult in a WIO because we have to track more students than we did before, and it's somewhat more complex. So to kind of unpack this, we have, as Marcella pointed out in our tool, we talked The handout briefly has some of the steps in developing a survey and also planning tool at the end. And there's more information in the NRS TA guide that's always been there, and it remains there about how to do surveys in somewhat detail, and also in the post-exit guide. There's some information too. And then under the tips, I think those are important to think about, especially if you're using this with your local staff or when you're just thinking yourself about surveys. And so we have like 5 things here. So keep it simple. In other words, surveys can be long, but you don't have to be for this stage. Basically, ask the person if they get a job, do they get a credential, and you'll know what to ask them if you keep track of them, of which indicator applies to them. Of course, response rate's important. So one of the ways to do that is to familiarize participants, to increase response rate, is to familiarize participants with the whole process, that they're going to be surveyed. Here's why we're surveying. Here's why we need to reach you. We're only going to ask you these few questions, so please keep in touch with us. Maybe even give them the survey. Here's the survey. Here's the questions we're going to ask you. And do that periodically, not just when they walk in the door, but throughout the whole time, and particularly when they exit, the whole time they're enrolled. And technology here is something where it can be very helpful. I know some states are using apps and websites and social media. Build it into your data system. Definitely use your data system to track the participants by which indicator, and how successful you are at keeping track of them. You know, data are really your friend here when you're doing this. Who to contact and when, and whether they've reached them or whether they're not interested, and then you don't need to waste time trying to reach them. Another thing that I think is something that I haven't discussed before, and I think in the WIO environment is new, is to strategically decide who to survey. So it might seem overwhelming if you're a big state, particularly, to get, oh, how are we going to do this big survey? Well, you don't have to start off big. You can start off small. Pick a small site, or rather a large site. A site that's going to, maybe a big program that's going to give you a big payoff. Because one thing that's about WIO, if you remember when we started today, if this participant doesn't have the outcome, or you don't have any information, you have to count that as not achieving employment, not getting your credential. And so you're missing participants who were successful, and you want to show that success. So by having a survey method and focusing on the places where you're most likely to get a payoff when you have limited resources will help you. So I'm talking about large programs, or even particular participants that you know or you think are more likely to achieve the outcome than others. You can focus on those. And so one easy example is if you know somebody is not in the labor force, they told you that. I'm retired, I don't want a job, I'm not looking for a job. Well, and you have to survey, don't ask them. Use your resources to ask those that are probably unemployed, or those that may have told you at the beginning that I'm trying to get a better job. So things like that can help you target your resources more effectively on what is a very difficult activity, making it simple, using technology, keeping in touch, and being strategic in how you ask. And do it gradually. I like to think of it as kind of like in the beginning way back when we first had NRS, we had to think about pre and post testing a lot, and it was hard to get post testing rates up, and people thought, oh, well, people just leave, we can't test them. But that's improved quite a bit over the years as people have focused on that and done things like set targets and doing some of the same strategies we're recommending here. So, and that is on page 18 of your handout, and in much greater detail in the post-exit interview guide. So just a reminder about that. And so as you think about that, and I see we have a few responses and people still typing about using that. When you make a decision as a state to do this, bring this into your local staff who may be very reluctant and very overwhelmed by this, to make it seem more simple. And maybe just start incrementally. And I know Toby started off this whole session by saying surveying is hard, and it certainly is, so we're working to kind of make it easier, easy as a difficult thing can be. And I think if you use this tool and think about it and be strategic and plan it, it will seem less overwhelming and be more feasible. And will it actually help you with those participants who don't have Social Security numbers, who are you're not able to reach for whatever reason, or maybe they have jobs that aren't in the databases, some in the UI database, or not reported as was mentioned, or they will move in another state, or just the whole credential mess that we have mess in the sense that there's no single place for you to go to get information on credentials. So rather than just giving up, which is tempting to do, and it's without resources and time, to just take a step back and see maybe there are some things you can do, and start with baby steps or small steps, and they can have a big impact, and then you can build from that. So that's my sermon today. Oh, Terry. If you do survey, what documents do you require before you kind of employment? Well, we don't I don't think Octane, and I don't know if they're still on the call because I know they had to get off, or it was Andrew, Alan, and Jay, require any particular documentation at the federal level. Certainly we don't look at it if you keep it at your level. So we just, in the survey, we take participants' word for it as they say they're employed, and that's the only choice you have. If you look at the OMB directive, circular, whatever it's called, guidance on collecting collecting supplemental wage data, that tells you things you can look at, which are things like letters from employers, or I think that was on one of a previous slides. It will tell you copies of signed tax statements, signed letters, case notes, one-stop partner records. Those kind of things are what are allowed under WIO through that, as it's described in that circular. But if you're just doing a survey and you have none of these documents, we think we're not going to look at it. But Jay just wrote that please see the guidance on data validation guidance, and oh, that's right. I forgot about that. That recently came out, and you'll be able to access it on the NRS website, and that's guidance on data validation, Toby, and on anyone who has this question. And Jay just provided the link to it. And it's also on our NRS website in the appendix to the TA guide. And thank you for reminding me, Jay. I forgot that has recently been released. So that'll give you the guidance on what's acceptable for verifying data in general, and particularly in the employment data.
And Diane, I'm going to move your question. We're going to move to the Q&A section in just a minute so that we don't lose it. I'm going to put it in the chat for you, but I think we're going to move on. Before we do, I did want to mention we do have an NRS tool that does highlight also surveys and how a local program in Nevada has really focused on that and done a great job. So you can look for that on our NRS website. Okay.
Okay, so just really quickly, this is just an overview of the tools we've talked about. So you had the importance of calculating performance for the post-exit indicators that had the sample data and the discussion questions, the collecting unique identifiers such as Social Security numbers, activity, the tip sheet for how to collect data, and the supplemental data collection guidelines for conducting surveys that Marcel just talked about. And then we've got here just to, again, reinforce that the Demonstrating Success, the Technical Assistance Guide for Collecting Data for Post-Exit Indicators, is on the NRS web, and it's a great resource chock full of information. And then in terms of messaging and communication, we do have some communications course materials on NRS web as well that could give you some techniques and ways to, concisely get messages across to local programs on topics that you think maybe you're having trouble communicating. So there's some guidelines about that there. But we do want to open up for questions. Any questions folks have before we close out in about 10 minutes?
Yeah, I looked in the chat pod. I didn't see any questions yet. There was a discussion of the NRS, of the tape 1112, but I haven't seen any questions.
So recently we had a question that said, are corrections individuals included in the numerator denominator for employment? They are unavailable for work, so would they still be included?
No, if you are incarcerated at exit, you do not, the post-exit indicators do not apply to you. You just have to, you just report MSG.
Great. And there was a question earlier, can you mix and match, or can you mix data match and survey results on a single indicator? And Cody addressed that, but I wanted to give you an opportunity, Larry, if you wanted to say anything else on that.
Yes, you can combine both together when you do your calculation and when you're reporting on table 5.
Let's see if there are any other. Let's scroll to the beginning.
Okay, doesn't look like there's any other questions. If you have one, we have a couple minutes. Type it in or unmute your phone and say it verbally.
Earlier, Virginia had asked, does anyone match throughout the program year rather than at close of year?
I don't know if anyone would like to answer that.
Cheryl had said that we have done it at the end of the year, but are planning to do it quarterly this year. Okay, and Cheryl, I'm excited to hear how that goes for you, if that's something you want to continue doing. And New Mexico as well. Great.
Michigan, John.
Yeah. I mean, quarterly. Okay,
okay.
Michigan also. Okay. Is that where she's?
And Terry asked, if clients go to college and not employed, this really hurts our employment measures. Is there anything to be done on that? No. Okay. Sorry, Terry, there's nothing to be done. Okay. We already answered Virginia's question, but I'll put it back in our chat pod so we have that for our records. Sorry, and I know we already addressed that one.
Anything else?
So we mentioned the charges from unemployment that can make it difficult to match more than once or twice. Okay. Well, it looks like folks have asked the questions that you have up to this point. And of course, we're always available. So you can contact us with any additional questions that come up. But we do appreciate that you were so actively engaged today and shared a lot of really good ideas with one another. And before you leave the call, we'd really appreciate it if you filled out the evaluation form, which you'll see that there's a box at the bottom right that says web links to evaluation form. And if you click on the Browse To button, it'll reveal the URL for you to go to the evaluation and fill that out. And we'll still be on the line for a couple more minutes, so if any questions come up, we can take those. But otherwise, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
This is
See you next
Virginia. Can
time.
we ask one more question?
Sure,
course.
Virginia.
Hi, it's Heidi.
I heard your laugh, Heidi.
So, we are asking about credentials and the lack of a single credential database against which to match.
Or a database.
Yeah, so CNAs, auto tech, manufacturing, logistics, they're all different entities that administer those credentials, right? So we have instituted a policy that the programs have to have a verifiable, they have to have verifiable evidence of a credential earned in the student's folder on site when we come to audit in order for them to enter into our system the name of the credential, the date earned, the NAICS code, et-cetera. So we've got a backup, but it's not, that's not a match, and it's not a survey. How are other people doing credentials like that?
And is that acceptable?
Are you asking it the group or me or us?
Anybody in your group, Larry?
Anybody want to answer that?
Thanks, Larry.
Okay. Who did someone say something?
That was Tom.
Well, how do you mean you require them to give you the credential, bring it to you? How do you get it?
We have required our local programs to have verifiable evidence in the student's folder. So they have to have a copy of the credential, you know, an email that has it attached, something in the student folder that is really an...
Actually, Larry, the way it works is that we have it in the system. So programs can enter the post-secondary credential information in the system, but the caveat is that, or the requirement is that they have to have some sort of, you know,
Proof.
evidence, documentary evidence on site to be able to enter this information in the system.
Well, that's pretty high standard. Well, what, you know, it's hard to do this, as you said, and I don't have any great answers. What I have heard and what I'm actually was just working on some TA document about this is to first think about, I mean, just to kind of sit back and say, here's all the credentials that we accept and that we would have. And then you can do that individually by your providers, because not all credentials will apply to all providers. So kind of get an inventory first off of what would it be the kind of credentials our students are likely to get at each, you know, statewide, and then break it down by program. And then it's going to be a different strategy. It could be a local community college, it could be local employers, and then just a matter of developing kind of electronic or communication with the provider or with the individual student. Probably the college is better.
Well, the colleges we can do once, you know, as we get our data sharing agreement set up, but it's these outside entities, the industry,
Right.
associations,
Right.
et cetera, that are just one-offs. I mean, we can't chase all of that.
Yeah, right. So what I would try to do, I mean, one strategy you could do is, oh, you know, maybe you're not going to know this right away, but over maybe a year or so, you'll know who those providers are, or at least the main ones from your students by program. So maybe some, and then you can develop relationships with those particular, you know, institutions or training providers, and I guess it'll be a moving target. It might change from year to year, time to time, but that's one thing I can think of doing that. And you'll probably miss some, but remember, one good thing about that indicator is it's going to generally be a pretty small group with the restrictions. They have to exit, and then you have a year to do it, and after a year you don't have to worry about it. I mean, it's gone. So I guess in a very large urban area that could be really overwhelming, but I think in a lot of smaller programs, it probably, once you kind of get a handle on it, and it might take some time, it probably will be manageable, I hope. And so I think again, I think the first step is to kind of just take an inventory of what you're talking about, what credentials there are, maybe select the most prevalent ones if there's a huge number, and then just kind of focus on those, and then over time you would just have to monitor that and continue it. I mean, that's one approach, and I'm certainly not have any great experience doing this. I don't think anybody does, but that's kind of a good topic for us to do maybe at a future meeting or training about what's going on and how are people doing that. You know, it is a pretty new thing that we're doing this.
Mm-hmm.
And we just started doing it this year, I guess, really, or last year.
Mm-hmm.
And
so
I know
you would want us to take an inventory of specific credentials as opposed to credential types, because the way we have it set up on our student registration form, which is where programs can document the information, we identify the 4 types that are defined in the federal definition, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And then
yeah,
also in our system, there are things that the programs have to complete, and one of them is to identify which type of credential the credential information is supposed to represent.
Yeah, I think that's a good starting point, but you might not, you know, you have the 4 types, but maybe this particular program only does one of those types. So all I'm saying is you kind of make your load a little lighter by just like we know we don't give these X kinds of credentials, but we do give these. So just try to get an idea of what you're talking about, I think, is the first thing. It just seems amorphous credential. We don't know what that means. But so by kind of defining it and narrowing it to the extent you can will be, I would say, a first step. And I got this actually idea from Minnesota, which is did it with their did this and actually had some success on that.
Okay.
I don't know if you were at you went to the training probably in D.C. maybe. Yeah, in Minnesota was in St. Louis, and they gave a presentation on sort of how they got a handle, and they were talking more on secondary credentials, but one of the first things they did was sort of just inventory them. Like, what are we talking about, credentials? Where do students get them, and what institutions provide them? And so, you know, the federal list you have is the full list of everything. And maybe in, you know, Arlington or D.C. area, everybody's doing that, but maybe not in your smaller programs. So it just helps manage it, and probably nobody's doing all of them. So you might miss some, but at least, and you can build over time, but at least you can start with a manageable thing to make it manageable and not so overwhelming. Sort of what I was talking about in surveying too. That seems really overwhelming at first, but as you get a handle on it, it can get easier when you manage it.
So, all right, so this is really our second year of collecting this information. So we'll keep going as we are and reporting as we are, but start trying to understand what are our most common, who issues them. Maybe we can build a relationship with the Board of Nursing, for example, because we do a lot of CNAs. We'll just start down that path, but it's interesting to note that there is no easy answer here.
No, there definitely isn't. And then the other side, besides the credentials, is narrow down the students too, at who they are. You know, if you know what they're going for, you'll know what to follow up with. If you just know, and you will know that because you know what training.
The IET students are very high-touch students. We know them.
Right. So then on both ends, you can narrow that down to something manageable.
Mm-hmm.
But there isn't any easy answer, and everyone's struggling with this, and nobody has the answer. The only thing I've seen is what I just told you about Minnesota, and they were just focusing on secondary credentials, not post-secondary.
We don't have that.
They did a little bit on post-secondary. They did not completely on just secondary, but that was kind of their strategy, which I thought was really helpful, and they had quite a bit of success in doing it. So you might want to talk to Brian Haskamp. He knew it, but again, he was mostly on secondary, but they were thinking about post-secondary too.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for staying on for a minute.
Okay. Sorry you're not going to make our training, Heidi, but we'll see you later.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, thanks everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
I don't know if anyone's, yeah, 23 people.